just keeping a close eye on the Hawks in general because they feel ripe for. They're in the middle stage, right? They started tearing down a little bit, but Trae keeps them at this level. You could just knock that floor out and start a new house at this point.
And I think like there's some question of, well, does Trae Young just get sick of it and ask out? There's still a lot of questions of how committed Atlanta is to Trae Young. I think a lot of people assume that when they traded DeJounte that, all right, well, they're building, they've fixed that situation and they're building with their guard. I'm not sure they're necessarily committed. I think it's probably a lot more like, well, they weren't like Trae Young's value is so low and so depressed that it made no sense to trade him now. Well, let's give him maybe a team where he has the ball a little bit more. You don't have that, fight with the backcourt and sharing the ball, and maybe he can put up some better numbers or look a little better, rehab his value a little bit. I'm not sure that necessarily means if his value does bump back up a little bit, maybe not to where it was 2 or 3 years ago, but at least somewhere in the middle. If they, the Hawks themselves are like, all right, well, let's move on. Let's, build through the draft and see what we can get.
Yeah, the number 1 overall pick, Jalen Johnson, you mentioned already. And then there could be others outside of Trae Young where they would just start tearing down that roster a little bit more and getting on the move.
And so that's the big one, right? So to tie it back to the Sixers, Trae Young being moved, just him individually will have no impact on the Sixers because they're not trading for him. Doesn't make sense here, et cetera, et cetera. If Trae Young gets moved, that creates a potential domino effect where you say, hey, is Bogdan Bogdanović available? Because that's not a guy you generally keep on. If you're going full rebuild, that guy becomes a huge trade chip. He becomes
you
like
don't want to have him sitting there rotting on the
yes,
and you get something for him.
He, to me, is, if you're the Sixers, that's a final piece type of guy at the deadline, right? Because we talked a lot about Bogdanović last year as a trade target. And he checks a lot of boxes to me. Can play on or off the ball. Is comfortable coming off of the bench. Where think of a scenario where we go through most of this year and maybe Eric Gordon is one of your top 7 guys to start the year. You turn Eric Gordon into Bogdanović, who's a much more lively off the dribble player at this point. I'm a lot more enthusiastic about him as like the 6th man ball handler, the guy you're pairing with the Maxis of the world, playing in it. Imagine a lineup that's like Maxi, Bogdanović, George, Caleb Martin, and your backup center. That gives you a real chance to not just stay afloat. You're winning minutes in the playoffs without Joel Embiid. You're winning minutes in the regular season without him. Like, that gives you real firepower.
Yep. And
you have some defensive steel on the wing to help account for those guys in the backcourt. And so that would be where I would have my eye if I'm the Sixers. If you start hearing, hey, Trae's available from the Hawks, you got to start making calls on Bogdanović. I'm not a big DeAndre Hunter guy, but I would at least, I'd keep my ear open on him as well. Just like a toolsy wing that can do a few things. Maybe you change the environment, scale down his role. He makes a little more sense here. But the Hawks, to me, are a big domino team for the whole league because there will be a lot of sellers among bad teams at the deadline. Not a lot of them have as many guys that I think are like legit rotation players, right? Maybe you'll get a fringe guy. The Hawks have at least a couple guys that I think can really impact playoff rotation. Mm-hmm. And so if we get closer to Trae being moved by December, January, they are a team that the Sixers should be on the phone with them pretty constantly. Yeah. And I know they have some relationships down there, so they'll be talking.
Part of the concern there is if you take back more salary in a trade than you send out, you become hard capped at that first apron. Sixers are really close to that. So obviously you've got KJ and the $8 million or whatever he makes, but getting to that $17 million would be a little bit difficult. You'd probably have to include like Kelly in that deal. You might have to then include Jared McCain in that deal, just to make sure you're over that 17. But certainly he was, when we started talking about this topic for the show, he was on the short list just because of what you mentioned. He fits the Sixers. He's somewhere close to that salary range. And if Trae Young is moved, you would expect then a subsequent deal.
Year 2 of a 4-year deal with the Atlanta Hawks in the final year. Would
Good
be
value, too.
A club option.
And I think it's declining, too. So it's like 17 this year, but it keeps going
Yeah, I
down.
believe
17,
so.
16 in the final 2 years. When we come back, we'll get Derek's name that he wants to throw out there as a potential guy that could be on the move now that Lauri Markkanen is off the board. May it impact the Sixers like the Atlanta Hawks. Domino effect from Trae Young, as Kyle brought up.
We all silly like the mayor.